Now, it's the beginning of the prison release scheme. 5,500 prisoners to be released between now and the end of October. After all, we have to make room for those who've been beastly on Facebook, don't we? Now, Charlie Peters, GB News' reporter, was down with a camera outside HM Prison Wandsworth this morning. Just have a look at some of these scenes.
So everyone's been happy today, I'm sure, coming out there, haven't they? There's been a lot of happy people faces in the house, that's for sure.
Yeah. So you're grateful to Labour and you're grateful to
100%. I've I'm voted Labour all my life.
Yeah.
Labour's the one.
Well, there you are. He's been let out early and he's now going to be Labour all his life. I'm not sure that's really what it was for, but there was a party atmosphere outside there. People gathered outside the prison before the releases, playing loud music and champagne corks popping. I mean, look, it's, everyone's gathered, exciting, there's music blasting out.
Well, not very many people.
Where did they get the champagne from?
No, there's a few. Well, you'll see that in a moment. Here we are. Champagne time.
Is that the Grand Prix?
Big celebrations. Yeah, you've got first prize in the race. Well done. And I can also tell you that prisoners that came out were being given, and we can't show this on the television, but were being given already lit spliffs. But that's all fine, and that's what we do.
Do you mean reefer cigarettes, as they used to call them in the old days, Nigel?
That have a funny smell, absolutely.
Yeah, very funny smell. A smell that's much more common these days than it ever was before. Joe, people serving up to 40% of their sentences, some as small as 20% of their sentences, surely if they go to prison in the first place, they should stay there for a reasonable time?
Yes, they should, if there's space and capacity for them. But actually, as we were just saying in the break, and the previous government was already doing this. So there is nothing new in this that's happened. We've got the backlog of COVID, which is clogging up the courts with an awful lot of cases and some very serious cases waiting to get to court. And that means some people are held on remand for much longer than they should be. We've got a prison estate, as they call it, which is absolutely creaking at the seams and is in appalling conditions. I mean, it's coincidental that His Majesty's Inspector of Prisons report came out today and said, our prisons are on a knife edge. But what you've got from this is the problem, and there will be people who slip through the net. It is inevitable. But you've got a probation service that's been squeezed until their pips squeaked. You've got people who won't have homes to go to tonight because they'll be homeless. You have got all sorts of issues to deal with this. But you've also got the problem, I think, personally, that Keir Starmer dealt with the rioters in Southport and other places very quickly, very swiftly, and sent a message very clearly to people. But there are people out there, you hinted at it, Nigel, in your introduction, that domestic abusers are being set free. That is actually not the case. There may be people who... and this is very, it's nitpicking, but there will be nobody who is in prison serving a sentence for domestic abuse who will be released under this.
But who previously have served
or maybe serving something else.
So the issue here, I think, and it'll
become
become much more dramatic, because some of those people let out today will almost inevitably reoffend. And their future victims, whoever they may be, will wonder to themselves, why on earth were these dangerous criminals allowed to be let out early?
Well, it could be, Kwasi, because, your party in government oversaw a population explosion of 6 million people and didn't build a single new prison.
Yeah, so that was. I think the Conservative Party, my party, has some responsibility for this. Because we didn't build enough prisons.
Nowhere near enough.
But, as I say, this is a policy. They've come in and they've decided, they haven't said, OK, we're going to build new makeshift prisons. They haven't said that they're going to... There was a report that they were going to send them to Estonia. They haven't done that. They made a policy decision to let, 1,700 prisoners out early. And they will be responsible. If any of these prisoners...
Well, it's 5,500 by the end of October.
In 2 months.
Yeah.
And if any of those 5,000, God forbid, commits a serious crime, God forbid murder or anything like that, the government will be partially responsible for that.
Well,
and that's a very serious thing.
What it is.
The previous government.
And the previous...
Yes,
no, they're both...
I agree with that. But what I'm saying now is that once they're in, there's a problem, and they can deal with that problem how they will. They can say, right, we can make makeshift prisons. We've had suggestions.
What about
of
Estonia?
prisons.
Did that make sense?
No,
Estonia?
the Estonian thing was never. That was a complete
Why not?
fiction.
Why?
It was a fiction.
But why would it not make sense? I mean, if they've got prison
I'm not saying
capacity
it doesn't
there.
make sense. I'm just saying it was never.
So the point
it
I'm
was
trying to
never-
make
Because there is an irony about Estonia that we could send prisoners to Estonia with a cost the taxpayer less than having the British prisoners.
So what I'm saying is that the government is making political choices every day. And they will have to be held to account.
Well, governments do
so
that.
You can blame,
Governments do that.
They've chosen, forgive me, to let 5,000 people out in the next 2 months.
But Kwasi, there are people who, as yet, are not the victims of crime, who may not be the victims of crime from these people who are being released, who, when the police catch the person, the perpetrator, nothing can be done with them because there's no space in the prison.
Yeah, because it's clogged up.
I mean, there is a whole, and it's a much broader issue, and successive governments have failed to deal with.
Well, there are
which is the
10,000
whole
foreign
thing of-
prisoners.
So what we would export them
10,000
all.
foreign prisoners, get rid of the lot. Be loads of room then, wouldn't there?
Nigel, it doesn't
Then
take
why
you
not?
5 minutes, does
Why
it, to
not?
get onto
Well,
this?
why do you want? Do you want the taxpayer to pay for foreign?
Yeah, but it's really hard to get rid of them. That's the
Send
problem.
them to Poland
But you
or
know
Jamaica.
that. You
or
know
wherever
we
it is.
had a-
You know,
we
you've
had-
got the ECHR, you've got every court, you've got all
well,
the
there we are then.
lawyers,
Problem
you've got all the
solved.
lawyers.
And if-
The idea that you could just press a button and just
also,
ship these
if we
people
were
away,
dealing with
you
the
know it doesn't
backlog
work.
properly.
No, the ECHR would never allow it, and of course,
But our judges wouldn't allow it.
ECHR.
But
No,
forget-
no, and
a lot of our
all
judges wouldn't allow it.
the while, the European Convention on Human Rights is enshrined in British law. We'll never be able to do these things. You asked a question earlier: where are they all going to go? The Justice Secretary, Shabana Mahmood, said in the House of Commons today, "I've authorised probation directors to make use of alternative arrangements, including budget hotels."
Yeah. Well, some will go there, but some will
will.
just disappear. I mean, some will be on the streets tonight because there is nowhere for them to go. And of course, that in itself creates a problem because if you don't have an address, how do you then get
But there
registered
were
with all the
ways.
other
I agree that the
things?
Conservative Party, my government, was responsible in part for this because we didn't spend enough money building
No,
prisons.
sure.
But there are ways you could deal with the problem as now. It wasn't inevitable that they were going to let out 5,000 people in 2 months. And
Well-
that's a big risk.
Well, that's what they're doing. Now, let's talk a little bit about politics, about the TUC. Those of a certain age can remember the TUC was immensely powerful and very, very political. I've just got a sense that this TUC is now starting to flex its political muscles in a way that we haven't actually seen for decades in this country. GB News' political editor Christopher Hope was talking to the TUC General Secretary Paul Novak earlier on today.
I don't believe for one moment that most of those who voted Reform at the last election are racist. But let me say this clearly and unequivocally. Nigel Farage isn't a friend of the working class. He's a fraud. A public school educated, private equity loving, NHS privatising, Putin apologist fraud.
Now, interesting, isn't it? I mean, why should the General Secretary of the Trade Unions Congress choose to launch an attack on Reform, who may have a lot of voters but only have 5 members of Parliament? This, I think, is a sign we're going to see a very political TUC.
100%.
What say you?
So look, I met Paul Novak when I was business secretary.
Yep.
And I used to be on Zoom calls with him. I met him a couple of times. I actually went to the TUC. And at that time, because they knew there was a Conservative government, they were on their best behaviour. It was like, the old days you dress up on your Sunday best. They couldn't have been nicer, couldn't have been friendlier. Seeing him in that clip suggests to me that you're right. I think they're militant. I think they see that their people are in charge. They got that great pay deal within about a month or 3 weeks of Labour getting in. And this is their chance. And they're going to be a lot more political, a lot more militant. And I think they're as strong as they are since for 40 years.
I mean, are we going back to the bad old days, Jay?
Well, I don't think we are because we haven't got that level of membership of trade unions, and we don't have the huge factories, the car plants and things like that. I mean, there was a time back in the day when I think most people knew the names of trade union leaders.
They were huge figures.
More than cabinet
that's right.
ministers.
Yeah,
I
that's
mean, you
true.
might have known the Prime Minister and the Chancellor,
But
but
that was it.
about it. But you knew those
People like Jim Jones and all these guys.
exactly.
They're the household
And I
names.
think,
Yeah, that's right.
work has changed. The very nature of work has changed, and trade unions have had to change to adapt to it because they're not getting the bulk membership that they used to from the factory
But
gates.
they still, I mean, let's face it, they still fund about 85% of the Labour Party's income comes from trade unions. Labour are back in power.
But not all trade unions fund the Labour Party.
That's true, but a chunk of their money.
Yes, of course it does.
But Kwasi's point is, they were on best behaviour when the
They were on best
Conservatives...
behaviour.
Now they have real leverage.
They were never political.
They have leverage, but they also have difference. I mean, I think Paul Novak has been very interesting in talking about the winter fuel allowance that we were just talking about. He has not, or in the interviews before the conference, he didn't call on Starmer and Reeve to do a U-turn, whereas Sharon Graham from Unite did. So there is a difference, there is a nuance. I think to a certain extent the trade union movement has always been the conscience, if you like, of the Labour Party, and there is no doubt that they will be putting pressure on a Labour government to do things. But don't forget, a lot of these people are the people who were being clapped on Thursday nights during COVID because they were key workers, they were shop workers, they were nurses, they were hospital porters, they were transport workers.
So I don't have an issue with the unions in themselves, okay? But what I was interested in that speech was he had a direct pop at you,
which I love.
But Nigel loves it.
No, of course you do.
And
you've got big shoulders.
Don't play to
No.
But it was a very political intervention.
That's the point. That was the point. I mean, Nigel was big enough to look after himself, and we're in politics, and we expect personal hits. But what interested me was the fact that Paul Novak, who I had very, cordial professional dealings with, suddenly has become essentially a political actor. And I think that's interesting, and I think that's a hint of where they're going.
But it's the first TUC conference with a Labour government for 14 years, and it is the first TUC conference
but you're making
since
our
the
point.
election.
You're making our point.
All of that's
they're
true.
more political and they're more militant.
There is an argument that maybe we need unions more than ever. All of us benefit from the struggles and the fights that trade unions across the centuries have
So look,
had.
my issue with the trade unions is that they are highly centred around the public sector, which is natural. But, in terms of private sector, when I was a constituency MP, most of the businesses operating in my constituency were private sector enterprises. And they didn't have very strong unions, and yet they had to deal with all the economic pressures that the unions and the union bosses dealt with.
Do you know what, guys? We're going to hear a lot more about Paul Novak. Whether he becomes a household name in the old days of the Len Murrays, etc., I don't know, but we're going to hear more of him.